This video is sponsored by Surfshark. The graph editor is the single most important tool for animation in After Effects, but so many people can't make any sense of it. And those who do generally have pretty strong opinions on which is the right graph to use. All of that ends now because I'm going to explain exactly how to use both graph types and why you should know how to use each of them. Setting keyframes in After Effects is easy enough, and smoothing out the motion using the Easy Ease function is also pretty easy. But what really unlocks the potential of your keyframes in After Effects is the graph editor, because you're able to control what happens between each of them with complete control and precision. And the graph editor can be a little daunting at first. It can be a little bit confusing to look at, but it doesn't have to be. Which is why in this video I'm going to explain exactly how to use the graph editor so that you're not confused by it anymore. But you know what else doesn't have to be confusing? VPNs, which is great because today's video is sponsored by Surfshark. If by some chance you don't know what a VPN is yet, it's a virtual private network, and what it does is protects your activity on the internet. And VPNs do this by encrypting all of your data to block it all from view. You can think of using a VPN like wearing pants. When you go outside, it keeps all of the important stuff private and secure. Another great bonus of a VPN is the ability to change your location virtually so that you can access things that might be blocked in your country. So let's say that you lived in Spain and you had a limited Netflix library, but you wanted to use Canada's version of Netflix, which has a massive library. You can do that with a VPN. If you like to get work done from public places like coffee shops or restaurants, connecting to a public Wi-Fi can actually be pretty dangerous for your important data. But because you can use Surfshark VPN on any of your devices with one account, all of that data stays encrypted wherever you go. And that's one of my favorite features of Surfshark VPN is that I can use it on an unlimited number of devices with one account. Because I have multiple phones, computers, tablets, gaming consoles, and streaming devices that are all protected from that one single account. Seriously, look how easy it is to connect on my phone. All I have to do is click on the connect button and I'm instantly connected to a private server. They also have 24/7 support, so you always have access to them whenever you need it. And they have a strict no logs policy, so you can be certain that Surfshark is never collecting your data no matter what. And it's incredibly affordable. A 24-month subscription to Surfshark is one of the best deals that you can find online right now. And if you use my link or scan the QR code here on the screen, not only will you get 3 months of Surfshark for free, you'll also get 83% off of your order. Just make sure to use the promo code. It's that easy. On top of all of that, they have a 30-day money-back guarantee, so you literally have nothing to lose. Quit using the internet without protecting yourself. Thanks so much to Surfshark for sponsoring this video. Now, in order to understand how the graph editor works, I've created this project file here in After Effects that you can download and use to follow along with me for free. Just check the link in the description. And what I've done here in After Effects is just set up a simple onion skinning rig with a bunch of effects, but it's going to allow us to see every frame that this ball travels for the last 30 frames. So what I've done is just animated this ball going back and forth using linear keyframes. There is absolutely no easing going on here. And you can see that there is an equal amount of distance traveled between each one of these frames. The ball is moving consistently back and forth from point A to point B and back again. So that is a linear animation. Now, if I open up this second layer, if I enable it, it's got the exact same keyframes, but if I easy ease those keyframes with F9, then everything spaces out differently. And that term space is important because the timing of these keyframes are identical. If I zoom in here, let me just collapse some of this so we can see it easier. All of these keyframes are at the exact same spot. They're 1 second apart. The difference is the spacing between those keyframes. Instead of being linear, where the distribution of motion is completely equal from one frame to the next, we have frames that are easing. They're closer together at the beginning of this animation. They spread out towards the middle between the two keyframes, and then they start to bunch up again near the end. This is how easing in and easing out works. You put more frames at the start or the end of the motion and less in between where the motion should be faster. If I play this back, you can see that the frames where these keyframes are set are completely identical. There's nothing different between them, but we get a completely different feel with the easing between those two motions. And that's where most motion designers stop. And for the longest time, years of using After Effects, that's what I did too. Easy ease was all I knew, and that's all I wanted to do. The graph editor was terrifying, but let me show you just how simple it is to take it to a completely different level. I've got another layer here that I'll enable. Again, it has the same linear keyframes, all the same timing, but if I start by easing these keyframes and go into the graph editor, we see something that looks a little weird. We've got these two humps, and I'm looking at the speed graph right now. We're gonna take a look at both the speed and value graphs, but before I do any explanation, let me just show you that if I just increase the easing on both of these handles, incoming and outgoing influence on each keyframe, look at how much snappier that third ball is. You can see very clearly that the spacing is so much more dramatic because of how I eased these keyframes in the graph editor, and it wasn't difficult to do at all. Again, all of these keyframes have the exact same timing. If I jump from one to the next using the K and J keys on the keyboard to jump between keyframes, they're all in the exact same spot on each keyframe. It's just the frames in between and the way that After Effects is interpolating between those keyframes that's changing. And it has such a dramatic effect on the quality of the motion. This is something that Easy Ease just cannot do on its own, and why I think that the graph editor is the single most important tool that you need to know how to use as an After Effects user. And now that we can see what a difference it makes, let's actually talk about how these graphs work and why people get so confused by them. Let's start with this example. In fact, let's just turn off these other two layers, and I'll just bring up the keyframes for this one that we've already started to ease. I'm gonna actually reset these back to linear keyframes and go into the graph editor. And like I said before, I'm viewing the speed graph, but you can change your graph type view by going down to this menu right here. See, I'm set to speed graph. It might be set to auto select graph type, and then After Effects is kind of gonna choose which one it thinks is best suited for the property you're editing. But what I'd actually like to do is switch over to the value graph. That's the one that I want to talk about first. And it just so happens that with the position property, the way that I have it set up, it doesn't work. And I think this is one thing that a lot of people get caught up on. Why is my graph not doing anything? I can't edit these handles. I can't change anything about this graph. And I wish I had a better answer for why this is the case, but the reality is, we don't know. Adobe, for some reason, has locked the value graph on the position property specifically to not be able to work when the position is combined. You have to right-click on position and say separate dimensions so that you have access to each property individually. And now, if I shift-click and show both of those, the graph looks exactly the same, but I have access to each one of them now, and I can modify it here in the graph. So what are we looking at here? Well, first of all, it's the value graph, which is just a graph that is charting out the property that we have selected, its value over time. These squares right here are aligned exactly where the keyframes were because they also represent the keyframes. The squares, these are the vertex points on a vector path basically, but they're representing the keyframes. The lines between those squares are the change in value, what the current value is on any given frame in your timeline. So at the start of my animation, on the x-axis, I have a keyframe set to -717. Over time, that value increases until it gets to the right side of the screen and it becomes 813 pixels. This is the change in value over that time between those two keyframes. And because our keyframes are back to linear, this is charted out in a straight line, a linear graph. And the reason why the Y position is just a straight line across the board is because that value doesn't change. My ball is not moving up and down. I could change that though if I click and drag on this middle keyframe and drag it down. Now it's going to change the Y position as well as the X position over time. Now I don't actually want any Y position keyframes, so I'm just gonna get rid of them by clicking on that stopwatch, and now I can focus on just the graph type that's changing. So with all of those keyframes selected, I'm gonna click on this button right here, which is Easy Ease. Again, the keyboard shortcut is F9, but I have access to it right there. And now my graph looks a little bit different. If I play it back, there's my eased motion. But now instead of linear lines between the keyframes, they're curved, they're eased, it's smoother. The smooth graph corresponds to smooth motion. And I can exaggerate this by adjusting these handles and making my curves even more extreme. So if I were to grab, say, just this keyframe and I click and drag this to the right, I'm able to move this in any direction, but you see how that's changing the onion skinning, how it's changing the motion between these two keyframes. If I hold down the Shift key while I'm dragging, it's going to snap to being perfectly horizontal, which is what I want in most cases because it's going to very smoothly ease from a resting position into the change in value. So with that handle way pulled out, if I do the same thing up here, hold Shift and just pull this out, I've got a much stronger curve, and look at the spacing distance between all of these intermediate frames in the middle of the animation. If I play this back, we've got a super strong ease followed by the easy ease. See how much difference there is between those two motions. I can very quickly modify these handles and get something that's pretty equal coming back. But the cool thing about the value graph is that I can change this to be whatever I want. If I pull this handle up and this one up as well, now I'm gonna have a different shape that's kind of like a horseshoe, and you can see how that affects things. It's now easing very strongly into that second keyframe and basically bouncing off of that first position, because we're starting off changing value extremely fast, but then very quickly easing into a much smaller rate of change before jumping back down into a very fast-paced change and then looping again. You can also break the relationship between these handles. Right now they're linked, but if I just hold down the Alt or Option key, it's gonna switch to the Convert Vertex tool, and I can modify this just like a vector path. And now it's going to bounce very strongly off of each of these keyframes. So it's got this really weird easing where it slows down in the middle and bounces off of the sides. It's not very natural, but it's something that you can do very easily with the value graph. But let's just get back to our easy eased keyframes, and I want to switch over to the other graph type, the speed graph, which again you can do by going down to this menu and just switching to the speed graph. Now this looks a little bit different. And I think the speed graph gets a really bad rap because it doesn't make all that much sense when you look at it. Sometimes it goes up, sometimes it comes down. And for some reason, I think that people just don't like to think in terms of speed, but it's actually really simple to understand. Instead of a value change over time, it's the rate of change over time. It's how fast something is changing from one frame to the next. So with the easy eased keyframes, we're moving at a value of 0 pixels per second at the start, and then it eases into getting higher and higher until it's going about 2300 pixels per second, and then it begins to slow down again before moving in the opposite direction, which is why this graph is now going in the opposite direction. It's moving in a negative pixel value change, so we're gonna get an inverted curve. Again, this is the easy eased curve, but we can make this more extreme just by selecting the keyframes, clicking and dragging, and I have snapping enabled. This magnet down here, I almost always have this enabled, but that's what's allowing this to snap to the baseline of 0 pixels per second. If I disable the magnet, then I can very easily misalign this, and I don't want that. So I'll keep that enabled, and I'll just exaggerate all of this motion, and now we have much stronger spacing between the keyframes. And I can exaggerate that as much as I want to really make a snappy movement of this ball just moving back and forth. And again, I just want to reiterate that this graph really is not that confusing. It's speed over time instead of value over time. So again, we start off slow, it stays slow for a while, and then suddenly speeds up really fast and then decelerates before it gets to a resting position and does the same thing in the opposite direction. And what I like about that is that it's completely consistent across any property in After Effects. You can use the speed graph with absolutely any property and still see the same kind of readout in the graph editor. So if I recombine the position and just uncheck separate dimensions, I lose my easing, but I can quickly recreate that just by easy easing and then pulling these handles out. But if I were to change, say, the Y position on the second keyframe and move this up, you'll notice that I don't have two graph lines in my graph editor. It's all just managed by this one curve, which in a lot of cases is really nice because this also allows us to enable the motion path. If I switch to my pen tool, I can now interactively change the motion path within my comp just by clicking and dragging and basically shaping the path that this ball takes over time. And it's just like editing vector artwork. I have Bezier handles coming off of these vertices, and I can completely change the motion while controlling the easing between those points. So I'm basically able to interact with the graph editor and the motion path and control those two things independently. Shape the path that the ball takes interactively and visually in the comp, and then change how quickly it goes from one keyframe to the next using the speed graph in the graph editor. But even though I do enjoy the speed graph, that doesn't mean that I don't want to use the value graph. In fact, let's go over to the second comp where I have set up a ball bounce, and I'll just make this a little bit bigger so we can see it, but the ball bounces. This is something that I did with separated dimensions and the value graph because it is so much easier to do this type of animation using the easing controls that we have in the value graph. And let me show you what I mean. I'll clean this up a little bit again so we can see this. All I had to do to get this ball to bounce is animate the X position going from the left side of the screen to the right and taper it off, and then animate the Y position changing with this value. All of these keyframes are actually identical. They're all on the ground, and what's creating the bounce is the easing or the spacing between those keyframes. And you can see that reflected in the shape of the value graph. It just visually makes sense. This is not an animation that I would have a fun time doing using the speed graph. In fact, let me just duplicate this and I'll turn the original off, combine those dimensions again, which is gonna lose all of the easing. And After Effects tried recreating this bounce by just implementing a motion path that mimicked the shape I had, but look at this motion. It does not feel natural at all, and I don't even want to think about how I would go about changing this to be the same animation using the speed graph. You see how everything's linear? It would take so much work to figure out how the speed graph should look in order to get that ball to bounce. But here's another little trick. If I go into ball 1 again and look at those keyframes, viewing the speed graph, you can see what it looks like. It doesn't make a lot of sense, does it? This Y position curve is just weird. It's changing speed very quickly before changing directions completely while still moving fast, easing in the middle. This is not a curve that I would really even understand how to make using the speed graph if I was trying to create this from scratch again. And I want to jump over to the next comp because this is the opposite problem. This is an animation, if I play it back, that I would never want to do with the value graph because I'm able to just draw the motion path when the position dimensions are combined and I have the speed graph to control the spacing between keyframes. And on top of that, I'm even able to set rove across time for some of these keyframes, so I don't even have to worry about where they are spaced out between the other keyframes. I can basically tell After Effects, look, I want my ball to be at this position at a point in time, but I don't know where yet. What I'm really concerned with are these keyframes right here at the start, the middle, and the end. These other two positions can be wherever they need to be. We'll just let the easing of the speed graph, let me switch back to that, determine where they are. That's what rove across time does. To set that, you just right click on a keyframe and you say rove across time, and it automatically shifts based on the timing of the keyframes around it or the adjustments you make with the graph editor. You see how that keyframe is kind of just shifting around that curve depending on how far I pull it around. You'll also notice that these keyframes never hit the baseline of 0%, and that's because I wanted this ball to constantly be moving but ease between those motions, never stopping. So I just lifted all of those keyframes up off of that baseline of 0 pixels per second. It would have been much more difficult for me to figure out how to get these curves to work using that value graph and produce this same type of motion. And I realized that could just be me. If you know how to use the value graph and it makes sense to you and this type of animation is no sweat, then that's great. I'm glad for you, but that doesn't mean that you shouldn't know how to use the speed graph because I think that there are certain scenarios where it just makes more sense to use the speed graph and motion paths than it does to separate the dimensions of the position property and finely tune each one of those to get the motion to look the way that you're trying to get it to. And sometimes you just simply can't use it, like with the path property. If I were to just add a path in here real quick, and I wanted to animate this with some keyframes, let's get rid of this fill and add a stroke. I've got a keyframe here, and then I just maybe modify the path so that it comes over to this side of the comp and changes shape. Now it's gonna go between those two. I cannot select this keyframe, go into the graph editor, and change this to be the value graph. Actually, this is displaying the value graph, and you'll see that it's just the speed graph. That's because there is no value to this path that can be displayed in this graph type. All it can do for us is give us the change between keyframes using the speed graph. How fast that path changes over time, so I can ease it that way. Now, if you're interested in learning how the graph editor works from the ground up and some other really cool tips and tricks on how to use it, I have a Skillshare class called Animating with Ease where I do exactly that. I teach you everything you need to know about the graph editor, how to work with pre-comps in some pretty clever ways, and create this really cool house build animation that you can completely customize. If you're interested, check out my Skillshare profile where you can get a free trial to Skillshare. Just follow the link in the description. And be sure to browse all of my other 30+ classes on Skillshare, all teaching different aspects of After Effects. Now, like I said, there's no reason to just stick to one graph type or the other. In the next example, I have this artwork that all animates on using Easy Ease. Everything is fine, but it doesn't look that nice. It's very plain, very standard because of that default Easy Ease percentage. It doesn't look all that great, even though a lot is happening and there's lots of layers here. But I've set up another comp where we can edit these keyframes and try to make something that feels a little bit more snappy. So what I'm gonna do is just press the U key to bring up all of the keyframes and take a look at some of the motions. A lot of these layers are moving very simply. The people, this plant sliding in. So I'm just gonna select some of the keyframes that have similar motions, like the window, it's just scaling up from point A to point B. The people, both the keyframes for them sliding in and the CC slant effect. Same thing for the second plant, that one on the floor, although that bend effect is really an overshoot. So I'm gonna get rid of those keyframes because overshoots and bounces, those are handled slightly differently. But I'm gonna select all of the remaining keyframes up here for the scene control and the text coming in. With all of them selected, I can bring up the graph editor and view everything at once. And yeah, it is a little complex, but let's just see what we can do here. I am viewing it with the speed graph. So I'm gonna select all of my keyframes. They're already easy eased, but let me just zoom in. It doesn't really matter which one I have selected. And if I just grab one of the handles that's coming from the right, so the incoming velocity into the second keyframe, I'm just gonna pull that out and you see that that adjusts everything consistently. And that's really what I want. A lot of the times you're animating something on, it's appearing. So we don't need a lot of easing out of something. I can grab any one of those handles and pull it out to the left so that we're getting a very fast motion and a strong ease into this resting position. I'm gonna exaggerate that even further by pulling these handles out. Now, some of the properties in here are getting very extreme easings, these ones right here. So I'm gonna have to figure out which properties those are in order to adjust it, but it's just because the timing between keyframes on those properties is a lot different than other properties in my comp. So let me jump out of the graph editor. Let's see what that one change made. If I just play this back, look at how much snappier most of this motion is. People move in a lot more quickly. Now, one thing I didn't think about is how I want the easing for the scene control, which scales down the whole scene and brings in the text. I want that to ease out of the first keyframe. So I'm gonna select just those two properties, go into the graph editor and adjust that. So I'll just easy ease those two and pull these keyframes out so it's a more symmetrical ease. And now that's gonna fall out a little bit more consistently. But I forgot that the text is also synced up with that. So let me just select those keyframes as well, shift select them, go back to my graph editor, select them all, reset them to be consistent with easy ease, and now I can influence all of these keyframes identically, and it will be a consistent motion from beginning to end. So let's play that as a whole now. We've got all of these elements sliding in. It already feels a lot snappier, but let's take a look at the overshoot. Let's just isolate it to these hanging plants up here. So the lamp and the hanging plant, I'll get out of the graph editor and select those keyframes. Let's start with just the scale. I'm gonna select those, go into the graph editor, and for the scale, really I want it to be similar to what we had before, where it doesn't have much easing coming out of the first keyframe, it just strongly eases into the second keyframe. That looks pretty good. Now let's grab the rotation property, and this is using the speed graph, but I'm gonna change it to the value graph because, again, I think this makes a little bit more sense visually for things like overshoots and bounces, and I'll do a similar thing. I'll have all these keyframes selected and ease out everything all at once. Now, some of these keyframes at the end might need a little bit of tweaking because all of that easing with different timings being applied consistently might be a little too extreme. So I might wanna back these ones off a little bit until I get something that looks a little more smooth, but let's play that back. Now those plants and lamps come in really nicely, and the only thing left really is the bended effect for this plant. So let's find those keyframes, and they're back at the start of the comp. Select that property, go into the graph editor, and that doesn't look right at all. That probably came from the initial easing. Let me just reset that, easy ease it, and I can modify this curve. I don't really want it to ease out of that first keyframe, which is why I move that handle up, and then I'll just increase the easing on all of these, again while holding shift to snap it to being perfectly horizontal. And now that has a nice bouncy movement as it comes in. Let's look at that as a whole now. Everything feels so much more snappy. It's looking really, really nice. And if we compare this one more time to the easy eased version, you can see just how much of a difference it had. And it took me no time at all. See how this is so plain? It has really no personality at all. The overshoots honestly don't look that bad, but it looks so much better when you get into the graph editor and make some adjustments. It doesn't take that much time and it produces something that looks so much nicer. So I hope that that was a good explanation of the graph editor for you and that you now understand both the speed and value graphs. They really aren't that difficult to understand and they make such a dramatic difference visually to what your animations actually end up looking like. So get in there, practice, see how these two different graphs work, and if you're ever confused of why one graph is displaying versus the other, just go to that menu. Make sure you're looking at the graph type that you want to look at, and don't get caught up when you see something like the position property not working in the value graph. You either need to separate dimensions or switch over to the speed graph. These are little things that really trip up a lot of people, so I hope that this video was helpful to you and that you now have a much better grasp on how to use the graph editor. If you start using the graph editor and you want to show off your work, be sure that you tag me at Jake in Motion, either on Instagram or on Twitter. I would love to see it and share your work. I love it when my tutorials are able to help people like you, so please don't be afraid to share your work. Thank you so much to all of my support from patrons over at Patreon. Your support means the world to me, and if you're interested in supporting more tutorials like this one, then please consider becoming a patron. Just follow the link in the description. And if you have any interest in future tutorials, if you have ideas for videos, please don't hesitate to leave them in the comments. I'm always listening. Thanks so much for watching this video, and I'll see you in the next one.